In the salt marshes of the Carolina Sea Islands, the white men who hunted runaways had one rule: never follow a marked trail after the tide turns. They did not make that rule because they respected the swamp. They made it because of a 12-year-old black girl the plantation inventory called Ruth, approximate age 12, field hand in training, value $300. But the people in the quarters called her something else. The tide-born child. Because when Ruthie pointed toward the reeds and whispered that the water had a memory, grown men stopped laughing. And when slave catchers ignored her warning, the Marsh gave back their hats, their knives, their torn coats, but almost never their bodies. If stories of ancestral justice, forbidden rootwork, and children born as weapons against impossible systems pull you in, stay with this one. Like this video, subscribe, and comment where in the world you are watching from. Because the kind of power that rises from stolen labor, buried names, and black water does not stay trapped in one century. In 1842, the Wetherell Rice Estate stretched across a low bend of Tidal Creek outside Beaufort, South Carolina. From the main house, the place looked almost graceful: white columns, brick chimneys, live oaks dragging Spanish moss through the air like mourning cloth. From the fields, it looked like something else entirely. Ditches cut the land into wet squares. Sluice gates held back river water until the overseers decided when it would drown the rice and when it would drain. Mosquitoes rose in clouds. Bare feet sank into mud sharp with broken shell. People worked with water at their knees and fever in their bones, building wealth for men who called that suffering management. The Wetherell family measured every person they owned in ledgers. Age, condition, skill, estimated value. That was how Ruthie first appeared in writing. Not as a daughter. Not as a child. As increase. Her mother, Amma, had been brought from a nearby estate while pregnant, after Wetherell bought a group of field hands to replace the ones fever had taken. Amma was quiet, thin, and already half-haunted. Some said she had been born on the coast of Georgia, others said she carried songs from farther back, from women who remembered the other side of the ocean even after every law in the country tried to turn memory into contraband. Ruthie was born on a night of king tide. The creek rose past its banks. Water slid under cabin doors. Frogs went silent, the rice trunks groaned like animals. Lightning struck the Praise House bell and split it down the middle, though no one had touched the rope. The midwife was Nana Sable, an old root worker with milk-white eyes and hands that never shook. She delivered Ruthie in a cabin lit by one smoky lamp while wind pressed the walls inward. Baby did not cry at first. She stared. Nana Sable later said the child looked at the room like she was counting who had come to witness her arrival. Amma survived 3 days. On the last night, she gripped Nana Sable's wrist and spoke in a voice too calm for a dying woman. She said debts had been named. She said the water had agreed. She said her daughter would not be easy to keep. Then, she asked one thing. Teach her boundaries before the dead teach her hunger. Nana Sable understood enough to be afraid. Master Wetherell did not. When the old woman warned him that the baby should be sent away from tidal water, he laughed in her face. To him, a baby was future labor. A girl child was a small account that would grow larger if kept alive cheaply enough. So Ruthie stayed. For the first years, she seemed only strange. Crabs gathered beneath the cabin where she slept. The plantation dogs would not lick her hands. If she cried, water sometimes appeared where no water should be. A wet circle under her cradle. A damp line across a dry floor. A trickle sliding down the inside of a wall. The other children teased her until one boy pushed her into a ditch, and the ditch water climbed his legs like it had fingers. He was not harmed, but he never touched her again. At 9, Ruthie changed. Not all at once. Not in some theatrical burst of fire or thunder. It began with listening. She would stop in the middle of chores and turn her head toward the marsh, as if somebody had called her name from under the reeds. She knew when rain was coming before clouds formed. She knew which drainage bank would collapse. She knew which sick child would live if given sassafras tea, and which fever had already chosen its ending. Nana Sable began teaching her quietly, not because she believed she was making Ruthie powerful, because she realized Ruthie already was. The first slave catcher who vanished was named Gideon Vale. Vale was a narrow man with a scar across his mouth, and a reputation built on dogs, rope, and patience. He arrived after two brothers escaped Wetherell at the end of planting season. They had taken no food, no shoes, and no money. Only a stolen hoe blade sharpened into a knife, and directions whispered by an old woman at the washpots. Vale came with 3 dogs and an iron certainty that no enslaved man could outthink him in country he claimed to know better than the people born in it. He spent the morning questioning the quarters. He kicked over bedrolls. He slapped a boy for looking at him too long. Then, he found Ruthie carrying a pail of water behind the smokehouse. He asked if she had seen the brothers. Ruthie looked at his boots. They were still dry. That was the first thing people remembered later. Not her voice. Not her face. The way she looked at his clean boots as if they had already told her the end of his story. "You should go before the creek changes its mind," she said. Vale laughed. Ruthie lifted her eyes. "The water knows you," she said. "It has been waiting on a name." He grabbed her shoulder hard enough to bruise it. That night, Gideon Vale entered the marsh. By morning, the dogs came back without him. Their leashes were braided together with marsh grass. One had a strip of Vale's coat caught in its teeth, but it would not release it even when beaten. Searchers found Vale's boots standing upright in 6 inches of water, perfectly clean, as if somebody had set it there. They never found the man. The official story was quicksand, or alligators, or a misstep in unfamiliar tide country. The quarters had another story. Ruthie had warned him. The marsh had answered. After that, Nana Sable stopped treating Ruthie like a child who needed protection from power. She began treating her like a door that needed hinges. She taught her how to tie roots into cloth, how to mark thresholds with brick dust and salt, how to speak to the ancestors without inviting every hungry thing to step through. But Ruthie learned the rituals too fast. Sometimes she knew the second half of a prayer before Nana Sable taught the first. Sometimes the charm bags warmed in her hand before the last knot was tied. One night, Nana Sable drew a protection mark in ash. Ruthie stared at it, then dragged one small finger through the center and changed the shape. The lamp blew out. Outside, every frog in the ditch began singing at once. Nana Sable did not sleep after that, because Rootwork had rules. Bargains had manners. Spirits had preferences. But what lived around Ruthie did not behave like a spirit being summoned. It behaved like family reclaiming property. The second hunter came in winter. His name was Abel Crow, and he was smarter than Vale. He did not mock the quarters. He did not drink before a hunt. He had worked the Sea Islands long enough to know the marsh was not empty just because white law refused to recognize what lived there. He also loved money more than mourning. Wetherell offered double fee for the return of a woman named Bess and her 6-year-old son, who had escaped after the overseer threatened to sell the boy upriver. Crow took the job. Before he left, he crossed paths with Ruthie near the broken Praise House bell. The split in the bell had never been repaired. It hung in silence, a metal mouth that could no longer call people to worship, punishment, or burial. Crow stared at Ruthie. "I do not fear old women and mud tricks," he said. Ruthie reached up and touched the cracked bell. It made no sound. But every bird in the live oak above them lifted at once. "You will hear your mother call from the wrong side of the water," Ruthie said. "Do not answer." Crow spat in the dirt. 3 days later, he was found alive. That was worse. He came crawling from a drainage canal at dawn, gray with cold, eyes wide open, mouth full of marsh grass. Could not explain where he had been. He could only repeat one sentence. "She sounded like my mother. But my mother has been dead 30 years. Crow left South Carolina before sunset. He never hunted another runaway again. That was when the legend began traveling faster than the fear. Across rice fields, across ferry crossings, through praise houses, kitchens, docks, and markets where free black boatmen heard more than white men thought they did. There was a girl at Wetherell, a small dark girl with watchful eyes, usually barefoot, hair wrapped in faded blue cloth, hands scarred from work she should have been too young to do. If you were running, she might give you a charm. If you were hunting, she might give you a warning. Only fools ignored either. Master Wetherell did not know what to do with her. He could not sell Ruthie. By then her reputation had made her dangerous merchandise. No buyer wanted a girl rumored to bend tidewater and speak death over white men. He could not free her. That would mean admitting fear, and men like Wetherell would rather bankrupt themselves than confess that property had frightened them. He could not kill her, not because he had mercy, but because by then even he had started watching the marsh after dark. So he kept her close. He moved Ruthie from field chores into the main house, thinking walls might contain what ditches could not. She carried trays, swept floors, polished silver that reflected her face back to her like a stranger. The Wetherell daughters whispered that she had no shadow. The housekeeper refused to sleep if Ruthie had passed her door after sundown. Ruthie became quiet, not submissive, quiet. There is a difference. In the quarters, people came to her at night. A man with a split lip asked if it was safe to run before rain. A grandmother asked if her sole daughter was still living. A young mother asked for something to keep the patrollers from smelling milk on her dress when she carried her baby through reeds. Ruthie helped when she could, but the more she helped, the less she slept. The dead had discovered she could hear them. They came in dreams first, then in reflections, then in the wet dark between candle flame and wall. Men with no markers over their graves. Women whose children had been priced away from them. Children who had died before anyone wrote their names. They pressed close, not cruelly, but desperately. They wanted witness. They wanted speech. They wanted balance. Nana Sable saw Ruthie standing one night with her feet in a wash tub, speaking to water that moved though nobody had touched it. "Child," the old woman whispered, "a door that never closes stops being a door. It becomes a road." Ruthie looked exhausted enough to break. "What if they need me open?" she asked. Nana Sable had no answer that did not sound like betrayal. The third disappearance broke Wetherell's authority in public. A hired party of 3 men came after a family of 5 who had escaped during a thunderstorm. They arrived with guns, dogs, and a printed notice promising reward on return, alive if convenient, dead if necessary. The leader was Jonas Pike, a former overseer who believed cruelty was a credential. He found Ruthie in the laundry yard and demanded the family's route. When she said nothing, one of his men lifted a whip handle, as if striking a child were no more serious than closing a gate. Ruthie did not flinch. She looked past them toward the Tide Creek. 3 men came, she said. 2 debts are old. 1 is fresh. The water will decide which of you it wants first. Pike cursed her. That evening, all 3 entered the marsh. Only 1 came back. He staggered into the rice field before sunrise, bleeding from the palms where he had apparently tried to claw through oyster shell. He insisted the other 2 were still walking beside him, though everyone could see he was alone. He pointed at empty air and begged them to stop singing. By noon, His hair had turned almost white. By nightfall, he confessed in front of Wetherell and half the overseers that they had found the runaway family. They had cornered them on a hummock, trapped between tide and reeds. Then fog rose from the ground so thick the lanterns turned useless. In that fog, the men heard chains dragging. Not one chain. Hundreds. Pike fired his gun at the sound. The muzzle flash showed faces in the fog. Not living faces. Not dead in the peaceful sense either. Faces with open eyes and wet clothing, watching as if court had finally been called. The family escaped. Pike's 2 partners did not. After that, no professional slave catcher would take Wetherell's money without adding a price so high it sounded like refusal. The enslaved people noticed. Work slowed. Whispers sharpened. Fear began changing direction. That was the first real crack in the plantation. Not escape by itself. Not magic by itself. A change in belief. People who had been trained since birth to see white pursuit as inevitable began to imagine pursuit could fail. And once the mind can picture a chain breaking, the body starts testing where the iron is weakest. By the summer of 1848, Ruthie was no longer just a girl with a frightening gift. She had become a root. Runaways from neighboring plantations risked detours through Wetherell land to reach her. Some never saw her face. They only found what she left, a cloth bundle tucked inside a hollow cypress knee, a thread tied around a reed, 3 black pebbles in a line pointing away from the main road. Those who carried her charms spoke of dogs losing scent at water crossings, of patrol lanterns going dark, of voices humming low in the reeds, not quite threatening unless you were the one doing the hunting. Wetherell's debts grew. His rice yields fell. Other planters stopped visiting after dusk. Children begged not to sleep near windows facing the creek. So, Wetherell did what powerful men do when power stops obeying them. He hired a man with a title. Reverend Silas Crouch arrived from Charleston calling himself a spiritual corrector, a Christian lecturer, and a specialist in African superstition. He wore black wool despite the heat, and carried a polished case full of brass instruments, chalk powders, little mirrors, scripture pages, and iron rings he claimed could bind unclean influences. He announced that Ruthie was not powerful. She was contaminated. He announced that the quarters were not protected. They were deceived. He announced that the marsh was not a witness. It was wilderness, and wilderness existed to be mastered. Manna Sable watched him from her doorway and whispered, "That man has mistaken a courtroom for a stage." Crouch demanded that Ruthie be brought to the rice barn before sundown. Wetherell agreed. Every person on the estate knew the ritual was meant to break more than one girl. It was meant to restore the old story. White command above, black fear below, the natural world silent, the dead irrelevant. Ruthie stood barefoot in the barn, while Crouch drew a circle around her in chalk and salt. He read from scripture. He shouted Latin he barely understood. He rang a handbell over her head. Ruthie stared at the floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then water seeped up through dry, packed earth. Not a flood, not even a puddle at first. Just a dark, wet line, crossing the circle from beneath Ruthie's feet. The chalk softened. The salt clumped. The handbell cracked from lip to handle, with a sound like a bone splitting. Crouch stepped back. Ruthie finally looked at him. "You came to bind what my mother paid for," she said. "You brought borrowed words to a debt house." Crouch slapped her. The barn went silent. Even Wetherell stopped breathing. Ruthie's head turned with the blow. Slowly, she faced him again. Behind her, every hanging tool in the barn began to sway, though no wind had entered. Nana Sable pushed through the watching crowd and grabbed Ruthie's wrist. "Not here," she whispered. "Not with everybody standing close." That was the darkest mercy of Ruthie's life. She could have answered in that moment. She could have opened whatever stood behind her, and let it take the man who had struck her. But if she had, it might not have stopped at him. The dead were not a blade. They were weather. Once released, they moved according to pressure no living hand fully controlled. So Ruthie swallowed the storm, and it poisoned her. For 9 days after Crouch's ritual, she shook with fever. She saw the marsh from underneath. She heard drowning men and crying women, and her mother's voice somewhere beyond them all saying, "Hold the door, daughter. Do not become the hunger." While Ruthie burned, Crouch prepared a second ritual. This one would happen at the creek. Wetherell to gather armed men, dogs, overseers, and 2 hired trackers. They would force Ruthie to the water at midnight and make her renounce the spirits in front of the entire estate. If she refused, she would be sold south before dawn. If no buyer would take her, Wetherell said, there were ways to make a body disappear in tide country. The Quarters heard, the Quarters planned, and Ruthie, still weak, finally understood the secret her mother had left inside the bargain. The water did not obey her because she was special. It answered because Amma had given it a condition. No hand that came to claim a human being as property could cross Ruthie's marked water without being judged by what it had done. That was the mechanism. Not random revenge. Not childish anger. Not a curse that struck anyone nearby. A tribunal. The marsh did not hate all men. It remembered hunters. At midnight, they dragged Ruthie to the creek. Crouch stood with his Bible open. Wetherell stood behind him with a pistol. The hired trackers held the dogs tight as the animals twisted and whined. Manna Sable had already done her work. All along the bank, hidden beneath mud, were small bundles tied with blue thread. Names had been spoken into each one. Names of the escaped, names of the lost, names of the sold, names nobody had written but somebody had remembered. Crouch ordered Ruthie to kneel. She did, not to him, to the water. Then she pressed both hands into the mud and said, "Court is called." The creek went flat. No ripple, no insect sound, no frog voice, no breath of wind through the grass. The dogs lay down and covered their heads. Crouch began shouting. That was when the water rose. It did not rush like a wave. It climbed, slow and deliberate, over the bank, around boots, around gun stocks, around the wheels of Wetherell's carriage. Every man who had come armed felt something wrap his ankles. Not rope. Memory. They saw what the marsh knew about them. A boy sold because one of them needed gambling money. A woman whipped because another had lost face in front of guests. A man hunted for 3 days and returned only to die from fever and chains. A child torn from his mother before sunrise. Some men screamed. Some prayed. Some fired into the dark. Crouch tried to lift his iron rings, but they were already rusting in his hands. Ruthie looked at him with tears running down her face. "You said wilderness exists to be mastered," she whispered. "But this is not wilderness. This is witness." By morning, Reverend Crouch was found sitting on the church steps in Beaufort, miles away, barefoot and unable to speak above a whisper. He had no wound anyone could find, but his hair was wet with salt water, and every mirror he passed for the rest of his life cracked down the middle. 2 trackers disappeared. Wetherell survived, but not whole. He returned to the main house before sunrise and locked himself in his study. That night, he never again stood within 10 yards of the creek. The plantation continued, because evil systems do not collapse the first time they are frightened. They adapt. They deny. They write new rules around old terror. But Wetherell's command had been broken. By 1861, war had come close enough that even the rice birds seemed to feel it. Rumors moved through the sea islands faster than orders. Gunboats in the Sound. White families packing silver. Overseers hiding documents. Enslaved people watching roads with a kind of careful stillness that looked like obedience only to those too arrogant to read it. Wetherell planned to move the people inland before Union forces could reach the coast. He called it protection of property. The Quarters called it theft after theft. By then Ruthie was 31, though some said she still looked partly like the child who had first worn Gideon veil. Her hair was wrapped in blue cloth faded almost gray. Her back carried work scars. Her eyes carried tides. She had spent nearly 20 years making hunters afraid of water. Now the whole estate needed more than a charm, they needed a crossing. On the night Wetherell ordered the inland march, 67 people were gathered with rope, wagons, and armed men at their backs. Children were told not to cry. Elderly people were shoved forward. The tide creek lay ahead, black under a moon hidden by cloud. Ruthie stepped into the road. Wetherell raised his pistol. For the first time in years, he said her name. Ruth. She shook her head. That was your ledger name. Then she turned toward the bound people and spoke loudly enough for every cabin, every tree, every grave, without a marker to hear. Walk when the water opens. Wetherell fired. The pistol flashed. Ruthie fell to one knee, but she did not fall all the way. The creek answered. Fog rolled in from the marsh so thick it swallowed the wagons. The ropes binding wrists grew slick, then soft, then snapped strand by strand. Iron buckles bloomed red with rust. Horses reared and broke traces. The men with guns found themselves shouting at shapes that were not people but memories wearing people-sized darkness. Nana Sable was long dead by then, but those nearby swore they heard her laugh from the reeds. Ruthie stood again, one hand pressed to her side, blood dark against her dress. Now, she said. The enslaved people moved. Not blindly. Not panicked. Guided. The marsh, which had devoured hunters for years, made paths where there should have been none. Sandbars rose under bare feet. Reed beds parted. Children were carried across channels that should have been too deep. The old and sick found firm ground exactly where they needed it. Behind them, Wetherell and his men wandered in circles until dawn. Some survived. Some did not. All of them came out changed. Most of the people Wetherell had tried to steal inland had reached the protection of Union lines near the coast. They carried mill gold, no legal papers that white courts would have respected, no proof of ownership over their own bodies except breath, witness, and the fact that they had made it. Ruthie did not go with them. Those who looked back saw her standing at the creek's edge. The fog had thinned. The first light touched the water. She looked smaller than the legend, and older than any living person should have looked. A child asked if she was coming. Ruthie smiled. Somebody has to close the door, she said. Then she walked into the tide. Water reached her knees, her waist, her shoulders. For a moment she turned back toward the land, where she had been born as property and become something no ledger could hold. Then the creek took her gently. They searched for her body for 3 days. They found only a blue thread tied around a cypress knee, with 3 black pebbles beneath it and a piece of cloth from her mother's old headwrap folded dry inside a shell. The people buried that bundle like a body. They sang over it, prayed over it, argued over whether Ruthie had died, returned, or simply gone where the living could not follow. The story traveled. In freedmen's camps, in churches, in cabins built by hands finally working for themselves, elders told children about the tide-born girl of Wetherell Marsh. Some said she was a warning, power born from suffering always asks payment. Some said she was proof, a system can own paper, guns, dogs, and courts, and still fail against memory organized into courage. The truest versions held both. Ruthie had been a victim. Ruthie had been a weapon. Ruthie had been a daughter loved so fiercely that her mother bargained with the only court that would hear her. And whether she was spirit, legend, or history sharpened by grief, people walking the old marsh roads at dusk still knew not to laugh at the water. Because sometimes a place remembers what the law tried to erase. Sometimes the dead are not gone. And sometimes the child a master calls property becomes the reason his hunters learn fear. If this story of Ruthie, the tide-born girl who made slave catchers fear the marsh, stayed with you, like this video so more buried stories can find their way back into the light. Subscribe for more tales of resistance, haunting, and ancestral justice. And comment where you are watching from, because memory travels farther when many voices carry it.